so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my November wrap-up, which is, for once in the last few months, actually on time, so this is very exciting. So today I'm going to tell you about all the books that I read in November. I read 8 books in a month, well, 7 books and 1 graphic novel, and I really enjoyed most of them. One of them I especially enjoyed, so yes, exciting things to come. So I will start off as usual with the classics. In November, the first classic book I read was The Well-Beloved, or The Well-Beloved, I'm not sure which, by Thomas Hardy, and this I buddy read with Yamini from The Skeptical Reader, and from Beyond the Pages, and Alicia from Ex Libris. We have been buddy reading our way through all of Hardy, or I joined it about halfway through. Next month, in December, we'll be reading The Hand of Ethel Birtle, and once we've read that, all of us will have read all of Thomas Hardy's novels, which is weird and kind of sad. Anyway, The Well-Beloved by Thomas Hardy. I didn't love this. I would probably go so far as to say this is my least favourite Thomas Hardy that I've read. It was just really weird. The Well-Beloved is about a man called Jocelyn who doesn't really love women so much as this particular ideal that he has. So he has this idea of like the well-beloved who is like some kind of spirit moving between different bodies of different women. The book takes place over about 40 years of Jocelyn's life, and we see him at 3 different stages of his life. There is a woman who he kind of is a bit in love with, but ends up kind of deserting for another woman in the first sort of third of the book, and he kind of traces then her spirit through generations of her family. And there were some things that I enjoyed about it. I loved the setting. It's set a lot of it on this island, and the setting is beautifully described, and the way this kind of tight community is so kind of incestuous and all the problems that causes, that's really, really interesting. But I just found Jocelyn creepy. I just didn't like him as a character. And there's a thing that happens about just over a third of the way through the book where you're like, well, this is silly and this is a bit creepy, but okay, fine. And then, like, 2/3 of the way through the book, in the kind of third part of the book, another thing happens and you're just like, no. No. Like I said, not my favourite Hardy at all. The other classic I read this month was in fact also Thomas Hardy, but this was a collection of his short stories called Wessex Tales. So as I said, I will soon have read all of Hardy's novels, but I still have quite a lot of short story collections by him to read. I really enjoyed the Wessex Tales. I've never actually read any Hardy short stories before, but I love his novels and I love his poetry, so it's quite interesting to see how he works on a different form. The short stories are all quite long, so they do have a lot in common with his novels in many ways, and a lot of them span a really long period of time, and we see sort of families and relationships change over time, which I really enjoyed. But my favourite story in the collection was the first one in my edition, which is An Imaginative Woman, which apparently isn't in every edition of the Wessex Tales and is sometimes in Life's Little Ironies instead. It's about a woman who is married but not very happily married. She doesn't feel that her husband really understands her. Her and her husband and her children end up lodging in this house, and when they're in this house, the woman, the wife, she ends up living in this room where this poet who she's heard of used to live, and in staying in this room and kind of finding things that belong to him, she sort of falls in love with this man she's never met, because she keeps on imagining this poet as the kind of perfect man for her life, even though she's never met him. She just knows things about him from his poetry and from the room that he once lived in, which she now occupies. And it's just a really interesting idea and really well done. So I really enjoyed that story, and I did enjoy the Wessex Tales as a whole. So I read 3 contemporary novels this month. The first one I want to talk about is Across the Nightingale Floor by Leon Hearn. I say contemporary, I think it's about 15 years old now, and this was around when I was a child, when I was a teenager, and it is aimed at teenagers, but I never got around to reading it. But Nick had recommended it to me and said I would really enjoy it, and he was right. Basically it's a teenage fantasy book, but rather than being set in like a Western medieval setting like a lot of fantasy is, it's set in a kind of Japanese medieval setting, which I really enjoyed. As you may have gathered from me talking about Japanese literature here and then, I'm really interested in Japan and history and literature of Japan, so I really liked that this had so many Japanese influences. I thought that was really, really interesting. We follow a young boy whose family and people are being persecuted. He ends up running out and getting away from the situation, and ends up getting picked up by a lord and sort of adopted by one of the noblemen within Japanese society. He begins to discover over the course of the book that he has some kind of mysterious ancestry and also some kind of mysterious magical powers. The other main character is a girl of about the same age as him, about 15, who she is the daughter of a nobleman but was kidnapped at a young age and is basically being brought up as a captive by a different noble family. It explores gender really, really well, this book, because I don't think any of the female characters were unrealistic for the time period that they're in, and it didn't feel impossible. Like, it really explores the kind of constraints that women might have been under in a society that is similar to medieval Japan. It really annoys me in teen fantasy, or any fantasy, when the male characters do too much of all the action and the female characters are a little bit pathetic. And there are points in this book where you worry that Cade is going to be pathetic, and then she does incredible things, and so I really like her as a character, and I thought she was really done, and the ending is just great. This is actually the first in a series, so I'm looking forward to reading more of these. Now the next book that I read is not actually published yet, and I do not know when it will be published, but I'm sure it will at some point in the future, and that is The Thickness of Blood by Andrew Stevens. So I mentioned a little while ago that I now have a literary agent, and I was contacted by one of the other authors who is represented by my literary agent, and we got chatting and decided that we would do a kind of manuscript swap. So he is currently reading my novel, which currently is called Pinpoints, and I read his novel, which is called The Thickness of Blood. So both of us have a literary agent. We're represented by Louise at Xeno Agency, but neither of us have publishers yet. So you cannot read The Thickness of Blood. It is not yet out, but I will link down below Andrew's Twitter and blog and things like that so that you can go and follow him elsewhere and look out for updates about his novel in the future. So I really enjoyed reading The Thickness of Blood. The book is set on 2 different single days, one in 1974 and one in 1981, and it splits between the two. Both time frames are seen from the perspective of the same character. In 1974 we see from the first person perspective of the protagonist when he is about the age of 9, I think. And then in 1981 we see from the perspective of the main character, but it's in third person. So the bulk of the book takes place in one single day in 1981, and this is Christmas Eve, and it follows one character, this teenage boy who is about 15 years old and is never properly named. And one of the things I love about The Thickness of Blood is the way that Andrew explores mental illness. Our main character suffers both from, to an extent, it's sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, but he also suffers from obsessive compulsive disorder, and there is something so compelling, so heart-wrenching, but also so brilliantly clever about occupying the mind of this boy for one entire day, seeing every small detail of his life and how the way his mind is and his mental health problems and his unhappiness, the way that influences everything he does. For one day we get so many plots and subplots coming into it, which I thought was just brilliantly done. Andrew writes wonderfully, and I loved the writing in this book. It's so well written, so poised. The detail is wonderful. Some of the writing is just so... it's so well observed, and it's so clever, and it's so beautifully and tenderly done. Like, you get to know all of the characters so well, and not just the main character. And this, I think, was very impressive, because the main character, partly because of his mental health issues, but also because he's a teenager, he is at times very self-centered and focusing entirely on himself. And yet Andrew manages to narrate something from the perspective of someone who is to an extent self-centered, but also to give you a really good idea of the characters and the complex relationships of all the rest of the characters around him. And I think that our main character, our narrator or protagonist, he's much more than being just self-centered. You do see moments of real kindness in him. He feels that he has become a bad person because of the way that his mind works and the life that he's led, but there are moments of great kindness between him and other characters, and I loved his relationship with his sister and with his little brother. I thought that was done really well. Overall, I just think it's a brilliant book. Really powerful, really beautifully written, and explores wonderful, like, fascinating things about family and how people change over time. So as I said, you cannot yet read The Thickness of Blood, but I'm sure at some point in the future it will be out, so I will link Andrew's Twitter down below so you can go and follow him for updates on his writing. And the other contemporary novel I read this month, which is my favourite thing of the month and possibly my favourite book of the year so far, that is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. Now, this is quite a big book, as you can see. I wasn't intending to read it all in the month of November. I was actually intending on reading it over 2 months, and I've been buddy reading it with Caroline from BBC Girl, but about halfway through November though we kind of diverged, and I was just enjoying it so much that I couldn't slow down the pace, and I just kept on reading and finished it a few days ago. This book is so good. I've owned this for about 2 years, and I kept on putting it off because it's so huge, and I just thought that I wasn't going to get through it, or that I wouldn't enjoy it, or it just seemed like a lot of effort. But oh, it's so worth it, and it's not a lot of effort because it's so good. It's so, like, I can't even, This book was so gripping. I'm not sure I've ever read another book that was so gripping. I got through this in 2.5 weeks, and it's 800 something pages, and I was reading a couple of other books at the time, or at least for the first week and a half I was reading other books, and then I decided that I didn't want to read anything but this because it was so good. So, The Luminaries is set in 1865 and 1866 in New Zealand, and basically deals with a kind of mystery in a gold mining town. So the book opens with a man called Moody, who has just come over on the ship, walking into a pub, and in this pub, he walks into a room and there are 12 men, and everything kind of stops when he enters the room, and he begins to realise after a short period of time that he has maybe interrupted something, and it soon becomes apparent that these 12 men, although from completely different walks of life, have all met here to discuss the same thing. They are a sort of council. And they take Moody into their confidence, and it comes out that they've been discussing this mystery going on in the town of late. 3 weird things have happened. A very rich young man has disappeared completely. A massive fortune has shown up in the cottage of a hermit who has also been found dead. And a prostitute has collapsed in the street from an overdose of opium and been accused of attempting suicide, something which she definitely denies. So from the very beginning of the book, we have this mystery, and the book is basically the solving of this mystery and what happened on this night in January of 1866. But it would be like degrading the book to say it's just a mystery, because it's so much more than that. It has a lot of characters. There are 13 men in this council, including Moody, who all of which end up being very, very important, and then there are quite a lot of characters outside of this as well. But somehow Ella McCatton manages to capture all of these characters wonderfully, to give all of them real stories, real backstories, real motivations. It never felt overdone or too long. It never felt like there were too many characters or too much plot. It's just so well written. The historical time period is fascinating. So many of the social issues in this book are so interesting. So many things about loyalty, so many things about the presentation of women and the way that women are treated within this society that is so male of the settlers in these New Zealand gold mines. So many of the issues about race. So we have, of the sort of 13 men in the council, 2 of them are Chinese and 1 of them is a Maori man. And the way that all of the white men treat them and react towards them, especially some of the awful racism against Chinese people in this book and in the society at that time, is just fascinatingly done and really, really interesting. The way it explores opium and gold and money and greed and revenge and just all of the things. So good, so good, so good. Now, I also read 2 short story collections in the month of November, one of which I loved and one of which I did not love as much. The first one I read, which I did not love as much, is this, which is Nobody Belongs Here More Than You by Miranda July. And I was so disappointed by this, because I'd heard so many brilliant, brilliant things about this, and Olivia Pope had recommended it to me on the basis that I would really like the writing, and I love the writing. I do. I think Miranda July can write really well, but oh, I hated a lot of the content. I don't think I've ever read a short story collection which has been so divisive for me. Like, obviously a lot of short story collections are hit and miss in their kind of nature, and there are a lot of short story collections I've read where there are many 5-star stories and a lot of 3-star stories. In this there are maybe 2 4-star stories and a lot of 1-star stories. There are a lot of stories I just really hated. The problem I had was there were a lot of stories in here that either kind of started with what seemed like a good premise and then seemed to fall short and in some way lose its poignancy, like the swim team, which I was really enjoying, and then it kind of just ended and I didn't really get why. Or there were a lot of stories, and this was the main problem for me, there were a lot of stories in this that felt like their content was just shocking for the sake of being shocking and that they didn't serve any other purpose, like the story The Shared Patio or Majesty or The Sister. Like, there were quite a lot of stories like that in here that I didn't feel served any purpose apart from to be shocking. I don't know, like, I'm sure there's more to it than that, and maybe I just didn't get it or it went over my head, but there were quite a lot of stories in here like that. There were a few stories that I did like in here. The story Something That Needs Nothing I did really like, and I found that much more engaging, and that there were sort of characters that I could find interesting and gripping, and I did find that story quite moving. And the final story, How to Tell Stories to Children, I really enjoyed as well, and I thought that was done well. I think it's probably important that the stories I liked much more in here were the much longer stories, because I did find that Miranda July did interesting things with characterization when she kind of had the time, but in most of the rest of the stories I just found that the characters were not believable or interesting, and that the writing was good, but it didn't really serve to convey anything, because the plot was just like shock value and nothing else. I don't know, that sounds really harsh, because I did like the writing, and like I said, there were a couple of stories I enjoyed, but no, this wasn't for me. I just found it weird. But a short story collection I read this month that I adored was this, which is Blind Water Path. And I bought this when I was book shopping in Oxford with my friend Jess, who lives around there, and I'd been to visit her, and I didn't know anything about this at all actually. I just picked it up on a whim because it looked good and because I could tell from the back that it was a realist collection of short stories, and I love short stories, but so many of the best short stories nowadays are magic realism, and I like magic realism, but it's not my favourite thing, so I'm always on the lookout for good realist short stories, and this was beautiful and I loved it. I noticed, because like I said, I picked it up knowing nothing about it, but I realised when I was reading it that actually one of the stories, the third story, number 3, I had actually read before. I'd read it in an anthology of like the best British short stories, 2014 I think. So that was quite interesting as well, because I knew I'd really liked that, but I kind of forgotten, and then I loved this. These stories are beautifully written, really quietly written, I suppose. Like, it never feels overdone in a way that sometimes Miranda July does. I'm sorry, I just feel like I'm taking it all out on Miranda July today. But like, the writing in here is poised and beautiful and lovely. The content is subtle but beautiful and moving. It tells the story of real people all over the world. I think this short story collection was just beautiful and the writing lovely, and it just fits so well together. One of my favourites was number 3, which is the story I've read before. Then I also love the title story, Blind Water Path, which is beautiful. Everything is Aftermath is also a gorgeous story, and there are so many beautiful stories in here. She draws characters so well that are so believable and realistic. I think that's the difference, just to compare this to Miranda July, is that I didn't find any of the stories in Miranda July believable. None of them, really. None of them. Whereas this, I felt like everything was believable and was real, and it really spoke to me and was just beautiful and just, yeah, so real. Another book I read this month, and I forgot about this when I was doing my list to begin with, which means that I actually read 9 books this month. But anyway, another book I read this month was Extraordinary Facts About Jane Austen by Henrietta Held. Now, I did really enjoy this. It's basically set out as interesting facts about Jane Austen, but actually it's not really a list of facts in that way. It's basically a chronological biography of Jane Austen's life, followed by an examination of her legacy in chronological order. I think it would be a really good place to start as an introduction to Jane Austen's life if you're someone who likes her novels but you haven't actually read anything about her biography and her life and her legacy, because it is very easily set out and really interesting to read. I think if you're someone that knows a lot about Jane Austen, probably not for you, because as with me, you might find it just a little bit going over things that you already know. But if you're someone who likes her books but doesn't know that much about her life, then I think this would be a really good place to start with knowing more about her life. And then finally, I also read a graphic novel in the month of November, which is quite unusual for me, but this was another one I picked up when I was in Oxford with my friend Jess, and it looked so pretty and so different that I decided to pick it up. So this is a gorgeous, beautifully illustrated graphic novel. I think it's really cute and just really nicely done. It's basically a man who is a postman and a little bit dissatisfied with his life, and one day he gets a call from someone who's found an item of his that's in lost property, and he goes to the lost property office and realises that everything in the entire lost property office belongs to him. And it's just really fun, really nice, really sweet and kind of moving, considering how short it is, but also just beautifully illustrated, and one thing that I really enjoyed. There we have it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of November. I had a pretty good reading month and I'm pleased with it. I'm especially pleased that I read The Luminaries, because that was, one, brilliant, but also really long and had been on my TBR for a very long time. So yes, that was good. So there we have it. Let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of these books and if you enjoyed them, and I'll be back very soon with another video.